We are talking about today the first, second, and third tithe. That's the message. We've got several passages that we're going to look at. And my goal here today is to present, and then your job is to determine. The Bible says that the Bereans were of noble character because they searched the scriptures daily to see if the things that Paul was saying was true. And I'm challenging you today to make sure that you take on that kind of mindset to search the scriptures. And I'll be the first one to tell you that, as I said earlier, for those of you who are here, this is one of those teachings that I knew I had to do, but I've been putting it off. And one of the things that I've learned in my years of working in nonprofit ministry and being in denominational ministry is that you don't want to tax the people. You don't want to wear people out. I had some problems as a young man, and Brother Roosevelt and I, we were having some conversation yesterday. We got raw because, sometimes based on where we've come from, we want to just cut to the chase, come straight down the middle, talk as men, of course, being respectful and honorable in the conversation, but really coming straight from the heart. And I admit that as a heathen, when I first came into this thing called church, I already had a problem with preachers. Because when I accepted the call of ministry, it was because I had been running for many, many years. I'm one of those people who ran from God and knew I was running. It wasn't a hind thought. It wasn't second thought. I knew the day I set out, the day that I said that I was not going to embrace what I believe you've called me to, because I knew since I was about 8 years old that what I'm doing today is what I was supposed to be doing. And it took me a lot of years to finally come to the place to where I embrace what he had called me to do. And there were reasons why I ran. One of the reasons why I ran is because I really didn't understand church or church people. They didn't make sense to me. It didn't make sense to me that people would go to church, hear a sermon, and go home and do the opposite. That stuff didn't make sense to me. Didn't make sense to me that we would talk about God and Jesus and the Bible and then do everything other than what God and Jesus and the Bible said do. I got the impression that there was really no fear of God. There was the knowledge of God who couldn't do anything. It was as if this God, now I got to tell you, I was brought up very religious. Some of you've heard some of my testimony. I used to sneak and smoke cigarettes. And when I'm away from home and nobody could see me, and I would smoke with my friends, and we'd be walking down the street, for some strange reason, and I remember when we passed by a church, I hid my cigarette. That didn't make sense to me, but that's what I did. Because for some reason, to me, and even though the church was empty, I felt that that was God's house. And I didn't realize I was hiding from him like I could hide from him. And see, people have a tendency, if they're not in church, God don't see them. And so for me, church was a place where you went to see him. And when you left him there. That was his house. He went in my house. And some of you all knew he wasn't in your house. People talk about him, but he wasn't there. And when Father called me, I made a conscious decision that I will not be a preacher. Now, I didn't know that when I joined the Navy, that was kind of like what Jonah kind of did. He didn't join the Navy, he just got on a ship. And I could recall out in the middle of the the Atlantic Ocean, where I would be on our submarine tender. This ship had about 3,500 men on this ship, and I would go to the deck and just sit for hours staring out over the ocean. And for me, that was peace. Being in that ocean where there's no people, and finding a place where there's nobody, it's just me and the ocean. But I didn't realize that in that place, I was looking for something I didn't have, and that was peace. You see, the peace that comes from him, you can't find it nowhere else. You may have moments of quietness, but inside there's a raging, and the ocean and the quietness of the ocean and the water and the sun and the flying fish and the dolphins and every now and then a whale. It was like nature being out in the ocean, but actually being in his presence. When I got discharged from the Navy, I continued to run from him. And the more and the farther I ran from the Almighty, the worse of a heathen I became. Until one day, it was like, there's no place else to run. And it was then that I embraced the fact that he had called me. But even after I came in, I also realized, like some of us, even though I came in, I wasn't completely surrendered. And part of the problem is preachers. So I had a real problem with preachers. And having a problem with preachers, to become a preacher, meant that I would have problems with me. In that process, brothers and sisters, what I've come to realize is that when it came down to money and preachers, the impression was all preachers was in it for was the money. And so I kind of avoid, for a long time, I wouldn't touch the issue of money and tithe. I just wouldn't. I wouldn't give my money. And I remember being one of those Elliot Ness, Al Capone, gangster movie loving individuals that Father gave me an analogy of protection money. That the gangsters would harass the proprietors of businesses for protection when the issue is that they weren't protecting them from someone else. They were protecting them from the one wanting the protection money. And Father spoke to me in a language that I understood. He spoke to me and he said, you see how the gangsters was harassing the proprietors for protection money? And in essence, what the people was paying protection from was the gangster. It's like, for me, and this resonated with me, YeHoVaH said, I'm coming to you for some protection money. The protection money was that which was due him. And when that analogy hit me, I stopped the $1 tithe or the giving of offerings. And from that moment on, began to tithe. And what he showed me is that regardless, the preacher might be driving a Lexus, he might be driving a Mercedes Benz or a Volvo or whatever the case may be, that ain't your business. See, the money is not the preacher's money. The money is my money. And if you want my protection, then you're going to have to give up what I've already ordained for you to give. Now, this is how he talked to me. He may talk to you a different way, but I got it. I've had an issue with tithing and then fundraising because it seemed like the last 25 years of my life I've spent fundraising. I've been in fundraising mode for a long time. I had a prophecy. I have several prophecies. And the prophecy was that you're going to raise millions and millions and millions of dollars for the kingdom. When I look back over the life that I've lived, especially after coming into the kingdom, I've seen where millions of dollars have been raised for the service of the kingdom. And I've seen that, and I know that to be a fact. And what I've seen him do in us in this short period of time, we just spent $1.45 million for a building, cash. I mean, that's no small feat, folks. And it wasn't my doing, it was him providing the resources, because there was a time when we were coming into this ministry, we didn't even know how we were going to pay, the rent. And then he brought cameras and equipment and all that kind of stuff. And Father's just really been blessing us. About a year and a half ago, the issue of this third tithe. Now, I didn't know about the second tithe. And I'll just tell you that my understanding of tithing came from, Crown Ministries and places like that, to where you pay God and you pay yourself. I didn't know that that was the second tithe, but that's not how it was presented to me, is that you set aside God 10%, you set aside yourself 10%, and then you give to charity. That was the Christian's way of addressing this issue of the first, second, and third tithe. But it wasn't until about a year ago that it really began to resonate that there's something to it, and I need to search it out. And I kept saying, one of these days I'm going to teach on it. One of these days, one of these days, one of these days. And today is that day. So we're going to get into it. Here's what I realized during this searching period. And it became about 4 months ago, I began to think about, okay, what are we doing to help widows? And started looking. This is something that I've been doing privately, secretly. Because what my wife and I have done privately and secretly is we've handed out little somethings here's and there's and that kind of thing. And a lot of what we've done secretly. We've not made an issue out of it. And we still won't make an issue out of it, because I believe what the word says, that which you do in secret, he will reward you openly. So it's not about drawing attention to what we do. But I began to look at ways as how we as a congregation could be able to help the widows, the orphans, the poor. And looking at ministries, and at one point I was giving to certain types of ministries, and then I realized they weren't teaching Yeshua, they were teaching Judaism, and I stopped giving there and started looking for other avenues and would give offerings here and there and that kind of thing. And then purposely beginning to set aside resources for that purpose. The second thing was when we came up with this disaster relief, was really trying to help people who are struggling. And this all goes back to when I was searching out Paul, how Paul was going around collecting for the saints because of the famine that had hit Jerusalem. And so I'm looking for ways as to how we could be an authentic ministry and literally do what the Bible teach. And that means that somehow we got to figure out how to help people, not just help ourselves, but we also have to take the responsibility of what that means so that we can effectively help people, not just throw money at problems. Because that's what I came out of, throwing money at problems. And for years, we threw money at problems in our attempt to try to help a situation. But here's what I realize is that you can't help a person unless you give them his truth and they're willing to walk in his truth. Otherwise, you will be married to a problem in perpetuity. I realized when I was going through counseling in Bible college, that many people who came for counseling ended up in a lifelong relationship with their counselor. And I wasn't looking to become a counselor for life. If people aren't willing to apply what the Almighty gives them, they will always be in a situation to where they're going to need help. And oftentimes the best way to help people is to get down into their situation and see where the problem really is, and then address the foundation, the root of the problem, so that a person now can begin to apply the remedy to solve that problem, and then walk out that solving of the problem from this point on, and therefore they don't need me in their business no more. Well, how many of you know that Father, from the very beginning, is more concerned about his creation than any of us? He made provision for the animals. He made provision for the sparrows, for the crickets, even for the worms. The maggots got a job. Everything he created for a purpose, and the moment the purpose of the thing that was created gets distorted, things go into a problematic state, and it's going to be a problem until he intervene or somebody under his tutelage intervene and resolve that issue. See, part of the problem that we have today for many of us is that we grew up in families who weren't about Father's business. They may have been about denominational business. They may have been about religious business. They may have been about church business. But you can't be about Father's business ignoring his commandments. See, he's already set things in order. He's not going to go back and readjust the moon or readjust the way the sun functions or the planetary movement of all of his creation. That's already done. And he didn't make something clean to come along later and says, you know, I think I made a mistake. I should make that clean now so the people who want to disobey me can eat it. The swine will always be a swine. The catfish will always be a catfish. The crab will always be a crab. And they all have a purpose. You see, when you take all the crabs and the catfish and the shrimps and the mollusks and all of those things out of the water, the ecosystem of the water gets contaminated, and that which is clean becomes, what do you call it? It becomes contaminated. So now the fish got too much mercury or something else that it's not supposed to have, because the thing that is designed to keep the water clean for the fish that are clean to stay clean is being eaten. People are eating the unclean stuff that Father designed to keep things clean, and that which supposed to be clean, kept clean by the unclean stuff. When you remove it, how is it going to stay clean? So now everything gets contaminated. Father made provisions for the fish. He made provisions for the creepy crawly things. He made provision for his people. He made provision for the poor. He made provision for the widow. He made provisions for the orphans. Leviticus 27:30. We're going to talk about the first tithe, the second tithe, the third tithe, and then we're going to talk about gleaning. And then we're going to have a Q&A. Hallelujah. First, we're going to talk about the first tithe, Leviticus 27:30. Again, yesterday a question came up. Brother Wade came here and started something. He didn't know he was watering the seeds that had already been planted and stoked. And Father says, okay, how long you go ignore this teaching? And then I got home last night after teaching that message yesterday, talking about reflection, correction, projection, thinking, okay, I'll put this teaching off to the first of the year. But the people won't be prepared for Passover if I do that. Those who will take this and run with it, and those who don't, then that's totally up to them. Leviticus 27:30. And all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the trees, is whose? Whose? Does that ever change? You see, the thing about YeHoVaH is that he can take what's his and give it wherever he please. He can. Now, this is important because there are people today who say the tithe belonged to Levi. That's what they say. And the fact of the matter is that the tithe never belonged to Levi. They always belonged to YeHoVaH. And that's an important piece. That's probably the most important piece in this whole first tithe issue. The land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree, is YeHoVaH's. It is holy unto YeHoVaH. And if a man will at all redeem aught of his tithe, he shall add thereto the fifth part thereof. And concerning the tithe of the herd or of the flock, even of whatsoever passeth under the rod, the tenth shall be holy unto who? YeHoVaH. Now I'm going to tell you something about this fifth part. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I don't get involved in people's tithe. You see, your tithe is not between you and me. It's not. Whether you tithe or not is totally up to you. Nobody can make you do it. And when you give, there are people, they think they slick. They ball up their little money, put the hand in the basket and drop it so people can't see them. Now, that may be one way that people give secretly. I don't know. Others who put it in an envelope, don't put their name on it. Maybe that's secretly. I don't know. But the fact of the matter is, nobody in this room know whether you're tithing but you and him. You get this? I don't know. I don't know how much money you make. It's not my business. How much money you make is none of my business, and I have no problem telling you that, because it's not. And whether you're giving a tenth off the gross or a tenth off the net, I have no clue. And truthfully, it's not my business. Why? Because it's not my tithe. Tithing is between you and him. Now, how do the Levites or anybody else know if a person redeemed part of their tithe? He wouldn't know, would he? But YeHoVaH does. And whether a person add the fifth part thereof, who would know that? Nobody else. See, the point is that the tithe always will be between you and the Almighty. And whatever reason you have for doing it, or whatever reason you have for not doing it, that too is between you and him. Isn't that right? I try to stay out of it. I don't try to count other people's money, not trying to get into your pocket. What Father has for me, he knows how to get it to me. What he has for you, he knows how to get it to you because he's already made provisions. The only thing that hinder the provisions of the Father from getting to you is you. Concerning the tithe of the herd or the flock, even whatsoever passeth under the rod, the tenth shall be holy unto YeHoVaH. He shall not search whether it be good or bad, neither shall he change it. And if he change it at all, then both it and the change thereof shall be holy. It shall not be redeemed. How would the priest or the Levites or anybody else know that the animal that the person presented as a tithe was changed? He would know. Right? Who would know? These are the commandments which YeHoVaH commanded Moses for the children of Israel in Mount Sinai. So that's the first tithe. This tithe is holy, and who does it belong to? It belongs to YeHoVaH. The tithes consist of all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land, or of the fruit of the tree, the herd, or of the flock. It is not to be eaten by you or your family. Why? Because it's holy. Not given to the stranger. You don't give it to the widow. You don't give it to the fatherless or anyone else. It is holy unto YeHoVaH. The second tithe. This is a tithe that is done every year. The first tithe, the Bible teaches all the tithe of the land. This is every year. Deuteronomy 14:22. Thou shalt truly tithe all the increase of thy seed, that the field bringeth forth year by year. And thou shalt eat before YeHoVaH your Elohim. Now in this passage, it seems like now you eat the tithe. Or is this the same tithe? You are to eat it in the place which he shall choose to place his name. The tithe of thy corn, of thy wine, and of thine oil, and the firstlings of thy herd, and of thy flocks, that thou mayest learn to fear YeHoVaH your Elohim always. And so Deuteronomy 14 says this particular tithe now, you're going to eat it in a certain place. The tithe that is holy, you don't eat it. You don't give it to the widow. You don't give it to the stranger. You don't give it to the fatherless. You and your children don't eat it. But this one is different. And not only do you eat it, but you can only eat it in a certain place. Now this is the second tithe. And if the way be too long for you, so that thou art not able to carry it, or if the place be too far from thee, which YeHoVaH thy Elohim shall choose to set his name there, when YeHoVaH your Elohim has blessed thee, then shalt thou turn it into money, and bind up the money in thine hand, and shall go unto the place which YeHoVaH your Elohim shall choose. And thou shalt bestow that money for whatsoever thy soul lust after, for oxen, for sheep, for wine, for strong drink, or for whatsoever thy soul desireth. And thou shalt eat there before YeHoVaH your Elohim. Thou shalt rejoice, thou and thine household. So this particular tithe, which is a second tithe, is a tithe that is set aside for you. Now this tithe is not holy. It doesn't say that this is a holy tithe, and it doesn't say this tithe belong unto YeHoVaH. Deuteronomy 14:27. And the Levite that is within thy gates, thou shalt not forsake him. Now he's saying something here. The Almighty has taken the responsibility for the children of Israel, and he's taken the responsibility for the Levites. For he hath no part nor inheritance with thee. This no part or inheritance is that all of the tribes received an inheritance, which was land. So there was tribal land. The Levites didn't receive tribal land. They didn't receive land that they can call the land of the Levites. But they were given cities within tribal lands. They just didn't have an allotment of the land of Levi, like the land of Judah, or the land of Benjamin, or the land of Ephraim, or the land of Manasseh, and on with the other tribes. This is what he's saying. So this second tithe is to be eaten by you and your household, where? At the feast. You see, when YeHoVaH gave his children these instructions, he expected them to obey them. The goal was that every one of the Torah observant believers were going to go up to the feast, and this second tithe was their provisions. The third tithe. The third tithe is the third and sixth year tithe, Deuteronomy 14:28. At the end of 3 years, thou shalt bring forth all the tithe of thine increase the same year, and shalt lay it up within thy gates. And the Levite, because he hath no part nor inheritance with thee, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow, which are within thy gates, shall come and shall eat and be satisfied, that YeHoVaH your Elohim may bless thee in all the work of thine hand which thou doest. Now, here, there is an instruction. Now remember, the first tithe, we haven't been told yet what to do with that. But we have been told that that tithe is what? Holy. So because it's holy, it belongs to who? YeHoVaH. It is not to be eaten, but he hasn't given the instruction as to what to do with that yet, but he made it clear who it belonged to. The second tithe was to be used to go up to the place where his name was put, And if the place was too far, if there were animals or produce, fruit, whatever the case, they could now sell that. No redemption necessary. And when they get to the place where he puts his name, they can now exchange it and buy whatever they wanted, and they could eat it. This third tithe, this third year and the sixth year, or every 3 years, which really in a year or in a cycle, a 7-year cycle, because 7 was the cycle of years where the land would rest in the 7th year. So there would be the first 3 years, and then there would be the second 3 years. And this tithe, at the end of 3 years, thou shalt bring forth all the tithe of thine increase the same year, and shalt lay it up where? Within thy gates. So this tithe don't go up to Jerusalem, or it don't go up to the place where he's placed his name. This tithe is to be gathered and laid up within thy gates. And the Levites, because he has no part nor inheritance with thee, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow, which are within thy gates, shall come and shall eat and be satisfied, that YeHoVaH your Elohim may bless thee in all the work of thine hand which thou doest. Now, the way this seemed to be presented is the first tithe is taken, and that is holy. It's separated from the rest. So when you take a tenth from 100, what does that leave? 90. The second tithe is a tenth from the 90. And that is set aside for you to go up to the place, and this is done 3 times a year. Now, if the people operated in obedience to what the Almighty is giving them, then they would have the provisions to go up, because the whole purpose of setting this aside is so that they can go up, they can have a good time, they can rejoice, and not only do they have enough, but they can also not neglect the Levites or whoever they may see that need. And they are to present something to the Almighty, because he says, don't come empty. Now, to the poor, that's a whole different ball game. But we'll deal with that in a moment. The Levites were paid. You see, the Levites had a job and they were paid for their work. Who did they work for? Who paid them? People didn't pay them. YeHoVaH paid them. They didn't work for the people. They worked for YeHoVaH. Because initially, the Almighty says, you're going to take the firstborn and you're going to set that firstborn male aside, and that's going to be the one who's going to work in the tabernacle. Or they're the ones who will be redeemed. The firstborn are the ones who will be set aside. They are holy unto YeHoVaH. But then he instituted the Levitical system to where he says, no longer will I be requiring the firstborn. However, you still must redeem the firstborn. The firstborn male needs to be redeemed, but the Levites I've selected now, and they will do the work. Now, how do you know this? The Levites were paid by YeHoVaH for the work they did in the tabernacle and then later in the temple. Numbers 4 describe the work of the Levites and the priests. So you can go to Numbers chapter 4 and you can read that. We're not getting into that today. Numbers 18:21. And behold, I have given. Who is the I here? YeHoVaH. I have given the children of Levi all the tenth in Israel for an inheritance. Why? For their service, which they serve, even the service of the tabernacle of the congregation. The word inheritance there is possession, property, a portion, a share. The word service there is labor, work. Labor of servant or slave, labor, service of captives, of subject, service of Elohim. And this is service, and this is servile work. You see, while the people could enjoy the feast and commanded not to do servile work, the work of the temple before and the tabernacle had to continue. This is why Yeshua could talk about the priest doing work, working on the Sabbath day, and not desecrating the Sabbath. Because if you have been instructed by the Almighty to work, then you got to do the work. And so the sacrifices were made, the morning and evening sacrifices, the Sabbath sacrifices, the special sacrifices, including if a person wanted to make a vow unto YeHoVaH, then they would bring that vow. If they wanted to dedicate something to YeHoVaH, then that would be brought and that would be used to dedicate. If they wanted to make some kind of a special offering, whether it be to the service of the tabernacle or to the service of the temple. Because when we go ahead, you're going to see that the table of showbread, somebody made it. The altar, somebody made it. The candelabra, somebody made it. The utensils, somebody made it. Which the scriptures show us that there were skilled craftsmen. People who made the cart for the furniture to travel as they went through the wilderness. The word serve, he says, they have no inheritance, but they will present service. They will serve. And that word means they will work. They will labor, do work, and it's used to serve as 227 times. Now in verse number 22 it says, neither must, Numbers 18, neither must the children of Israel henceforth come nigh the tabernacle of the congregation, lest they bear sin and die. So when he made the change, he says, listen, at first I set aside the firstborn, but now the Levites will be the ones who will do the work in the temple. So don't send your firstborn into the tabernacle. Otherwise, they're going to die. When people see in the Bible where the people went up to the temple or they went in the temple, helping them to understand, no, they didn't. They did not go in the temple. They may have gone into the temple courts, into the courtyard of the temple, but only those who had been designated to go in the temple or the tabernacle went in the temple or the tabernacle, or they what? Bear their sin and died because they have gone into an area that they have been unauthorized to go into. And the priest understood only one went into the Holy of Holies. And that was the designated high priest. How often? Once a year. But the Levites shall do the service of the tabernacle of the congregation, and they shall bear their iniquity. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations, that among the children of Israel they have no inheritance. So what's the statute? They never have an inheritance, and they will do the work of the tabernacle and the temple. But the tithes of the children of Israel, which they offer as a heave offering unto who? You see, when you present your offerings, you're presenting your offerings unto YeHoVaH. You need to understand that. It's still holy. Now, I know that there are folks out there who say that, we don't have to tithe anymore. And I don't argue with them. I don't dispute with them. What I did is I did a teaching on to tithe or not to tithe. And some people got the book, got revelation. Some people heard the teaching, got revelation. Some people who didn't tithe began to tithe, and some people who didn't tithe still don't tithe. But that's not my problem. Because what other people do, especially if they have been given the information, is totally up to them. My only responsibility is to get the courage, to follow the instruction, to stand before the people, and to tell the people stuff they might not want to hear, knowing that they might get upset, knowing that they might get angry, and some of them might try to rush me, but I'm glad I'm a big guy. Hallelujah. Some of y'all heard, I had a gentleman, he came to service one day and he wanted the mic to testify. And I'm always happy for a good testimony. And he got the mic. And he said, one day I was coming to the church with my gun to kill that man. That's what he said. Didn't he? Were you there, honey? Yeah. See, she'll shake her head on that, because I can't get her to just shake her head unless, she's 100% in agreement. But this is what the guy testified. He came up because his wife had left their church and started going to our services. And they were Seventh-day Adventists, and we were Messianic Hebrew. And so the wife left the church, and it upset the husband. And she continued to come, and then she started encouraging her mom and her dad and her sister. Now he got to go to church by himself because it's a Sabbath day, right? They come into our services on the Sabbath, and he's going to the Seventh-day Adventist church on the Sabbath. So our ministry created a problem in his house. And he figured the only way to resolve the problem was to eliminate me. Now, I'm thankful for the Holy Spirit. You see. Because as he testified, he was on his way to the church. That's what he called it. With his gun to take me out. But the Holy Spirit stopped him. Now, again, that's his testimony. And it's like, okay, praise you, Father. Hallelujah. That's one of those testimonies I could rejoice in for real. But how many of you know the Bible says that the prophet's responsibility was to teach the people the difference between the holy and the profane? That was the priest and the prophet's job. And yet the people that YeHoVaH sent his prophets to proclaim his word, they killed. They killed the prophets. One of them, they say, between the altar and the holy place. I mean, they got so irate, these jokers went up into the holy place to get somebody, a priest. And so I know that when we stand here and we preach the truth, sometimes, although most people want to hear truth and love it and embrace it, there are those who have their own agenda, and the truth that is being presented to them can be unbearable. I was reading as I was preparing yesterday's teaching, and just realizing that there were people, when we read, when all of these plagues that Revelation speaks about come upon people, instead of people repenting, they will get harder in their hearts. They will not accept the fact that these plagues are coming from the Almighty, even though it is clear that it is coming from Him, and yet they will not repent. There are some people, no matter how you minister to them, no matter how you preach to them, this is why Yeshua says, listen, y'all want to waste y'all time with that? Let me tell you, my disciples, when you go into a town and you're dealing with people who won't receive you, shake the dust. Don't argue with them. If they won't receive you and you're coming in my name, it's not you they're rejecting me. And there are people who are bent on celebrating their Christmases. They are bent on keeping their Easters. They are bent on doing their church stuff on Sunday and will probably never transition to the Sabbath because they're convinced that we are trying to earn our way to heaven. They are convinced that in grace they are good to go and they don't have to do anything except wait on Jesus. They are convinced. And I'm not going to try to unconvince them once I realize that all they got is an argument. And I'm talking to people and it's like, you know what? I like that emoji, you know, with the face, with the frown and the tears coming down. Because for some of the people that I used to know, and I see some of the stuff they post, all I could do, I can ignore it, but I just use that emoji. You know, I'm sad for you. You know, I'm weeping inside for you because I know you know better. How do you know? How do I know? Because I taught you. I taught you better than that. For you to be going down that path, I know there is no excuse. Now, there's some other people out there who don't know, and they got an excuse. They can say, I don't know, but you can't. And this is the whole purpose of the gospel, folks. The gospel message that we're supposed to go forth and share with people is so that they will be without excuse. They can't stand before judgment and say, we don't know if we've been doing our job. And let me tell you something, when the prophets talk about it, and the Bible says that if you as a watchman see calamity come and you don't warn the people, their blood is on your hands. We see calamity coming. We know Messiah is coming. We know that he's waiting for the gospel to go to the ends of the earth before he comes. And who has he given that responsibility to? So if we're not doing our job, we got a problem. This is why I believe Peter says judgment will begin with us. Before the Almighty judge the world, he gonna start with us. He says, if the righteous scarcely be saved, where shall the sinner and the ungodly be? The sinner is in the same category as the ungodly. This is why I reject identifying as a sinner saved by grace. When a sinner is converted by the Son of Righteousness, then that ungodly sinner has now been converted into a righteous man or woman. You don't remain what you was before Messiah. If you remain what you was before Messiah, you can say, I'm a sinner. But you say you've been saved by grace, and you're still a sinner? Where's the conversion? There should be a conversion. And that conversion, and Ezekiel puts it very clear, that if a righteous man turns from his unrighteousness, his righteousness will not be remembered anymore. But if an unrighteous person turn to righteousness, their unrighteousness will be remembered no more. And this is the conversation Messiah was having with Nicodemus. See, when you are born again, you are no longer in the state you were before the born again process. And now you are becoming the sons and daughters of the Most High. But that's a work on your part. And the apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastors, and teachers are to help you in that transformation process. The Levites also had to tithe. Verse 26, Numbers 18, thus speak unto the Levites, and say unto them, when you take of the children of Israel the tithes, which I have given you, he always remind them where the tithe is coming from. So yeah, it's coming from the people, but it belongs to me. And I'm giving it to you. And just so you are mindful of who it belongs to, you too got a tithe. Thus speak unto the Levites and said to them, when you take of the children of Israel the tithes, which I have given you from them for your inheritance, then you shall offer up a heave offering of it from YeHoVaH, even a tenth part of the tenth, a tenth part of the tithe. And this is your heave offering. And this your heave offering shall be reckoned unto you as though it were the corn of the threshing floor, and as the fullness of the winepress. Thus ye also shall offer an heave offering unto YeHoVaH of all your tithes which you receive of the children of Israel, and you shall give thereof the Lord's heave offering to Aaron the priest. So it says, I'm giving you, but you got to take it, a part of it, and give it as well. Out of all your gifts you shall offer every heave offering of YeHoVaH, of all the best thereof, even the hallowed part thereof, out of it. Therefore thou shalt say unto them, when you have heaved the best thereof from it, then it shall be counted unto the Levites as the increase of the threshing floor, and as the increase of the winepress. And you shall eat it in every place. You shall eat it in every place, you and your households. Now, Father went as far as instructing who in the household could actually eat it based on their state and condition. And you shall bear no sin by reason of it when you have heaved from it the best of it, neither shall you pollute the holy things of the children of Israel, lest you die. This was the instruction to the priests or the Levites. The 7th year, the Shemitah, and that was another, we did a teaching on Shemitah, and I believe we've got something back there on Shemitah, which is the 7th year. In the 7th year, Shemitah, there were tithes. You say, well, wait a minute, don't the land rest? Well, yeah, there was no produce that was to be harvested, but the animals were still having babies. And the 10th part of the animal was still required. Why? Because it was a tithe. So the tithe of the flocks and the herds continued, but no produce for the land is to rest. The land was not to be planted. In verse 1, and YeHoVaH spoke unto Moses in Mount Sinai, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When you come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto YeHoVaH. 6 years thou shalt sow thy field, and 6 years thou shalt prune thy vineyard, and gather in the fruit thereof. But in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land, a Sabbath for YeHoVaH. Thou shalt neither sow thy field nor prune thy vineyard. That which groweth of its own accord of thy harvest thou shalt not reap. Now, understand that if something was planted in the ground and the harvest took place, because everything that the Almighty designed to bear seed and reproduce, then it would be automatic that if the land was left alone, that during that harvest time, the seed from some of that which had been planted would fall to the ground. And therefore, it would produce all by itself. And so he says, that which groweth of its own accord of thy harvest, thou shalt not reap, neither gather the grapes. See, the grapes are going to continue to come. The trees and the fruit thereof, the oranges and the tangerines and the apples and the pears, they're going to continue to come. But he says, don't harvest it. Neither gather the grapes of thy vine undressed, for it is a year of rest unto the land. And the Sabbath of the land shall be meat for you, for thee, for thy servants, for thy maid, for thy hired servant, and for the stranger that sojourns with thee, for thy cattle, for the beasts that are in thy land, shall all the increase thereof be meat. At the end of every 7 years, thou shalt make a release. Now, we went through this last year, and I have purposed in my heart, because it's important for me that we all know that when someone borrows money from us, that creates a place in our heart to where we want to exact that which we have given out. If somebody owes us something. And one of the things that can happen in the heart of people is that somebody owes them and then they don't pay. You ever had people owe you money, they promised to pay you and they didn't pay you? Did it upset you? Did it bother you? And then you see them out there spending money? You go to the mall and they got a cart full of stuff. That's troubling, isn't it? And you got to watch it. And it's like you be wanting to go and take stuff out the cart, especially if it's paid for. It's like, how you going to be out here spending all this money? Have you forgotten that you owe me? And that can create malice, anger, bitterness, hatred, unforgiveness in your heart. And Father said, listen, understand that what you have, you're a steward, it belongs to me. So here's what I want you to do so that you don't take personally like that's your money that you loan. Because it's not yours, it belonged to me. And if you inquired of me before you did it, I probably would have told you not to do it. But since you did it anyway, and you didn't ask me, because I know them. And you knew too. Right? Now you all bent up and bound. because somebody is spending their money and haven't paid you what they said or promised they would pay. Father's saying, listen, you can deal with that for 6 years, and I'll allow it. But in the 7th year, let it go. That's the year of release. You let it go. He says, and this is the manner of the release. Every creditor that lendeth aught unto his neighbor shall release it. He shall not exact it of his neighbor or of his brother, because it is called the Lord's release, or the Lord's YeHoVaH's Shemitah. Of a foreigner thou mayest exact it again, but that which is thine with thy brother thine hand shall release. And so what is he saying? A person who is outside of the covenant, you can hold on to it. See, you cannot lend to someone who is outside the covenant. You don't have to. Someone within the covenant, you don't really have much choice. Save when there be no poor among you. Now notice, of a foreigner thou mayest exact it again, but that which is thine, which with thy brother thine hand shall release. Save when there shall be no poor among you. For the Lord shall greatly bless thee in the land which YeHoVaH thy Elohim giveth thee for an inheritance to possess it. Now, here's something that I kept seeing in different places in Scripture, and I had to kind of wrestle with it, and I still don't have I don't have a conclusion on the matter. And that is, in this place it says, listen, save when there be no poor among you. It's as if, okay, the people came into the land and they were allotted, but at that moment there was probably not a lot of there were poor folks. Some poor folks came out of Egypt. Why? Because they were slaves. Some people were fortunate enough to garner silver and gold from their neighbors, but then they messed around and used the silver and gold to build a calf, which ended up getting ground up, thrown in the water, and they had to drink. So there goes that wealth, right? So now they get in the land and there's some challenges. And Father's saying, except when there be no poor among you. In other words, he's saying there's going to be a day when there should not be a poor people among you, but this is predicated on people following his commands. If you obey these commands, you will be a lender and not a borrower. So the only time, if a person is poor after Father has fulfilled his commitment to the people, it's on them. Because he's saying, I'm going to provide everything. I'm taking you into a land flowing with milk and honey. Keep my commandments. And guess what? You will prosper beyond your imagination. And so he says, there shall save when there shall be no poor among you. For YeHoVaH shall greatly bless thee in the land which YeHoVaH thy Elohim giveth thee for an inheritance to possess it. Only if thou carefully, notice this, only if thou carefully. What if you don't? Then there may be some poor folks in the land. Now, by the time Yeshua comes along, he said, listen, the poor folks you're going to always have. And what is he saying? He says, listen, look around you. These people have been given the commandments, but they're not keeping them. If they were keeping the commandments, they wouldn't be trying to kill me. And the fact that they are going through the motion, but they're not keeping the commandments, then the portion of Deuteronomy 28 that was not designed for those who keep the commandments, but only those who violate the commandments, they can rest assured that poverty is on its way to their house. That's a promise. If you diligently hearken to obey all these commands that I'm giving you, all these blessings will come upon you in abundance. If you don't diligently hearken to obey all these commands that I'm giving you today, all these curses will come upon you. That's just the bottom line. And for the person who said, I don't have to keep those commandments, but still talking about I'm blessed in the city and blessed in the field. Really? You've heard them. Oh, I'm highly favored. Really? Who you living with? Well, right now I'm living in my mama's basement. And you blessed and highly favored. Stop lying. There's a lot of lying people. Now, when I did the teaching on true biblical prosperity, we talked about how prosperity looks different for everybody. See, some people are happy simply having enough to live on. And they are as content as two fish in a bowl. I mean, they're just content. They just swim around and stare. They're good. Some people, because of their desires. Now, I know people who like horses. Now, first of all, if a person like a horse, already they can't live in the city limits. So based on their own like, it's going to affect where they look for property. They also know that for every horse, they need a certain amount of acreage. They know this. So depending on how many horses they want, they're going to look for property that's got acreage. Well, with that property that's got acreage come acreage tax. Property tax. With that acreage and those horses come feed and straw, hay, because you got to take care of them. So that person's prosperity is going to look different than the person who wants a house on the corner with a picket fence. Because you might be able to get a dog in there. But you certainly won't have horses, and you won't have chicken, and you won't have geese, and you won't have ducks, right? You won't have cows, you won't have a barn to milk the cow. So depending on what your prosperity is going to determine where you want to dwell, because you don't need all that acreage. But don't point the finger at the person who's got all the acreage. Their prosperity looks a little different than your prosperity. Right? The Almighty says, listen, I'm going to bless you in the city and in the field. I'm going to bless you everything that you put your hand to. I'm going to bless the fruit of your womb. There's all these blessings that he has promised. But yet, in my generation, by the time I came along, Torah, what? What's Torah? I mean, I knew about the Tetragrammaton. I knew that. I didn't know about the Torah. I knew about the law. I didn't know the Torah and the law was the same. You hear what I'm saying? There's a lot of things that I didn't know because they didn't teach me. And that which they taught me, because there was a time before I decided to run from God, I was in the church all the time. I went to Sunday school every Sunday without my parents. Church. Bible, what was it? Bible camp, BTU and VBS. Vacation Bible. I mean, I was all up in that. And it was in those places that I saw the hypocrisy and decided, you know what, I'm not gonna get into that. You see. But the Almighty has determined that he was going to bless his people, but they had to hearken unto the voice of Elohim, to observe to do all these commandments which he commanded them this day. Verse 31, Deuteronomy 31, or verse 10, Deuteronomy 31. And Moses commanded them, saying, and this is another portion that deals with the 7 years, because the release of debt was to take place at the Feast of Tabernacles. And Moses commanded them, saying, at the end of every 7 years, in the solemnity of the year of release, in the Feast of Tabernacles. So last year, Feast of Tabernacle, we went through that process, and it was the conclusion of the year that we let the land rest. So my house, our home, and whoever else who participated, because we did the teaching, we didn't plant a garden, we didn't grow anything, and the fruit that came from the trees, we brought here, and the people took them and enjoyed them. And that was just us trying to do what we read in Scripture. When all Israel is come to appear before YeHoVaH thy Elohim in the place which he shall choose, thou shalt read this law before all Israel in their hearing. So even in the 7th year, when the land was resting, the people were still required to come up at the feast. They're required to come up 3 times a year, every year. Gather the people together, men and women and children. And this goes to something David taught some time ago when, it says that all the men supposed to go up. But here, gather all the people, men and women and children, even the stranger that is within thy gates, that they may hear and that they may learn and fear YeHoVaH your Elohim, and observe to do all the words of this law. Because, see, the stranger, the sojourner, is a person here who has decided to dwell with the people. Now, it was these people that folks decided they would come up with some kind of means where they could have fellowship. And I wonder if that whole Noahide law was something that was developed for a person who didn't make a conversion, but who would dwell in the land with the people. They didn't have an inheritance. There was also the aliens. And then, of course, there was the widow, the fatherless. And this is where gleaning comes in, because the Almighty had within his provision that everybody in the land would be cared for. And so additional provisions for the poor, the stranger, the alien, the widow, and the fatherless was made. Leviticus 19:9, and when you reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of thy field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of thy harvest. And thou shalt not glean thy vineyard, neither shalt thou gather every grape of thy vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and stranger. This was a commandment of the Almighty. And so when the owner of the land brought in the workers, he had to give them instructions. He had to give them instructions to leave certain portions of the field for the poor, the fatherless, the stranger, the widow. This is what he says: you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field. You're going to leave some. Neither shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. In other words, don't go over it a second time. Thou shalt not glean thy vineyard, neither shalt thou gather every grape. You leave some grapes on the vine. Now, I'm going to tell you This is unheard of in our culture. But his father's way of saying, listen, I'm concerned about the sparrow. The hairs on your head, I'm concerned about. Don't you think for a moment I'm not concerned about the people you may consider your enemy. So here's what you do, because your enemy is also part of my creation. Pray for him. And if he's hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. You see, the way Father has designed his people is that we are not to take on the customs of the world, nor become like the world. We're in it, but we're not to become like it. And the only thing that separates Jehovah's people from the world is his commandments. I am YeHoVaH, your Elohim. And when you reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not make clean riddance of the corners of thy field when thou reapest, neither shalt thou gather any gleaning of thy harvest. Thou shalt leave them unto the poor. Now here's the thing about the poor and the stranger and the fatherless and the widow. The strangers, the fatherless, the poor, and the widows, if they wanted to eat, they had to work. He says, don't glean, thou shalt leave them. So if they wanted some grapes, they had to go out there and pick them. Now, twice in the 3rd year and the 6th year, the people were to take a tenth and bring it and put it within the gates of their city, and the poor could come and take from it. But during the rest of the years, if they wanted to eat, they had to go out and glean. They had to go out and work, which support the teaching, if a man don't work, he don't eat. Thou shalt lead them unto the poor and to the stranger. I am YeHoVaH your Elohim. When thou cuttest down thine harvest in the field, and hast forgot a sheaf in the field, thou shalt not go out again to fetch it. Leave it. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and for the widow, that YeHoVaH your Elohim may bless thee in all the work of thine hands. Here's what you didn't see in the land. You didn't see no trespassing signs. Posted. Do not enter. That was not permitted. How could the poor get to it? But see, the people understood the Father allotted us this land, but it is not our land, because we still have to conduct and behave ourselves in a certain way in his land. Otherwise, we're going to see whose land it belongs to. Because Israel was kicked out of the land because they didn't obey the instruction of the Father that will allow them to remain in the land. He says, you won't let my land rest? Okay, I know how to deal with you. I'll just remove you from the land so the land can get its rest. You know, when I think about that, because during the feast we had some conversation, especially for those of us who are looking at gardening and planting and things of that nature, and we talked about pesticides. We talked about the kinds of things that people spray. They spray on their land, Roundup and all kinds of other stuff that creates some problems for people. And we talked about people who eat produce that are coming from places and it's non-organic and it's dealing with herbicides and and pesticides and the potential of being genetically modified. And our people are putting these kinds of things in their body. And they don't understand how something that has been re-engineered or something that has been defected to keep it from getting infected, that we're putting the defect and the infect in our temple. And we even went as far as, at least I broached the subject of individuals who are vegetarians who eat non-organic. It's just ingesting things into our bodies that are just not good. And even going to the point of, as long as I've been in this world, I've yet to meet somebody who actually allowed their land to rest for a whole year. And you know, that says something to me personally, that and some things we can't really avoid, because the fact of the matter is that unless you go through the process of growing your own and growing enough and learning how to preserve and can and do all of the kinds of things that is required, then it's going to be difficult for us to avoid some of the stuff that's coming at us. The other thing is that science has not caught up with some of the stuff that it has approved to go on the market to be consumed. People don't know the full effect of how some of this stuff is going to affect each of us. We have no clue. If you're eating something that is not real, then it confuses the body. If you're eating stuff that has been genetically engineered in a factory somewhere with ingredients that you don't have a clue as to what they is, as long as it tastes good, then I will say to you, without any offense or trying to offend you, you don't recognize your body as a temple. See, when you see your body as holy, as the Almighty see your body as holy, when you see your body as a temple, as YeHoVaH sees your body as a temple, when you see the fact that He wants to dwell in you, then you would take the responsibility to make sure that you present something clean for Him to dwell in. But most folk just give lip service. See, when your body is a temple, you're going to be careful about what you touch. You're going to be careful about what you come in contact with. It's not that I'm afraid. I'm not afraid. But some of us, if we get around somebody sick and they're coughing and sneezing, common sense say, you know what? Maybe I don't need to be in that space lest whatever is on them jump on me. And then, you know, you look at people, now, I'm yet, and they probably got some organic tobacco out there. But most people who are buying cigarettes ain't looking for organic cigarettes. Which they shouldn't be putting in their body anyway. Only chimney's supposed to smoke. But Father has made it to where when you cut down the field and harvest it, He says, I want you, whatever you do, I want you to be mindful. I know I gave you the field. I know I gave you the seed. I know you call that your land. But you need to understand it belongs to me. So here's the instruction. When you go out there to plant, I want you to think about the fatherless, the widow, the stranger. When you go out there to till and to care for it, I want you to think about the harvest that you're going to bring forth. And then when you go out there to glean or to harvest, I don't want you to be so money-minded to where you forget about the vulnerable that I've instructed you to take care of by simply leaving food for them to come and eat. And if you see them out there in your field, don't chase them off. Today, now I remember I was talking about my wife when I was a child. We used to steal fruit. Now I'm the only one in this room who probably went on somebody's peach tree and took peaches, or went on somebody's apple tree and took apples, or not alone. Thank you for being honest. You know, I ate up a lot of people's apples and oranges, well, apples and peaches and pears. And I remember Mama Sis, she said, boy, get out of my tree. And we try to hide from Mama Sis, wait till she go, and then we go back into her yard. Her son, Bruce, would say, yeah, she gone. We go back there and eat peaches. We have a peach fest. But I also went places, and I went out there to grab something, and I heard a shotgun. I don't know if they were shooting up in the air, if they were shooting at me. I just heard a shot, and you know what I did? But that's the mindset of the world that we live in now, because they've been disconnected from the Torah. See, when people are connected to the Torah, they understand that this is not their land, that they're simply a landlord. But he is the Lord of the land. Because he said, what? The earth is mine, the fullness thereof, they and all that dwell. The beauty of YeHoVaH is he's not selfish. He shares. And he shares with people who don't even like him. He said, listen, when I send rain, I send it on the just and on the unjust. When the sun shines, it shines on the just and the unjust. I make it poor and I make it rich. I created good and I created evil. And everything has its purpose. And if you don't want to walk in the good that I've created for you, then I'll send you a little evil and hopefully you'll appreciate the good. Because sometimes he sends stuff our way to help make us appreciative. Something about a famine. It's something about a drought that make you see water different. When thou beatest thine olive tree, thou shalt not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and for the widow. When thou gatherest the grapes of thy vineyard, thou shalt not glean it afterwards. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and for the widow. And thou shalt remember that thou wast a bondman in the land of Egypt. Therefore I command thee to do this thing. See, before the children of Israel went into Egypt, Father already had a plan before they were even born. He spoke to Abraham hundreds of years earlier and told him what was going to happen. Now, the whole purpose of Egypt was to help them to remember where they came from. Because by the time he brought the children out of Egypt, that's all they knew. They knew nothing beyond bondage. They were in bondage for so long. They had a slave mindset. They never had freedom. And Father wanted them to remember how they were treated so that they would never treat people the way they were treated. When we forget where we come from, we lose our connection. When you think you deserve, we know what we really deserve. And we need to be mindful of that. And so he says, remember you were a bondman in the land of Egypt. Therefore I command thee to do this thing. I want you to show compassion even though people didn't show compassion to you. I want you to be a generous people even though people may have been stingy toward you. Don't allow how people treated you to shape you and to form you. Don't conform to the image of those who does not treat you well. Don't conform to that. Don't become like that. There's no justification in it. Always remember whose you are and whose image you should always be reflecting. Because if you keep your eyes on me, then you're going to what? You're going to project what I'm putting in you. And you're not going to allow what other people do to change who you are, because your change should come from me and me alone. Do unto others as you will have them do, not the way they do. Don't take revenge. It's mine. I'll deal with that. You reflect my glory. You reflect my love. And then when those who do things to you that is not good, I want you to show them kindness. I want you to be nice to them. Folks who are not nice to you, be nice to them. Because in that manner, you're heaping coals, hot coals on their head. People know when they're not having your best interest in mind. And without realizing, it's easy to conform into that. But I'm going to tell you something. It takes work. It takes work to become a child of YeHoVaH. It's a becoming process. And he's constantly trying to get us out of us. This is why from time to time I reflect on where he has brought me from, because I know where he brought me from. And I want to always remember where I came from so I never go back there. And the more I focus on him, I'm going to tell you something, the more this death process operates. The moment I want to get a big head, feel good about what I've accomplished, it's the moment I need to humble. And that's where we need to be, folks. Everybody in the land were not farmers and or herdsmen. Craftsmen who labored but were not herdsmen or farmers. And I'm bringing this to a close. There were occupations that individuals had that didn't produce a crop, nor did it bring forth animals. So the question is, how would they tithe? If you weren't a farmer or a herdsman, were you not required to tithe? And this is one of those challenges that, folks who want to say, well, the tithe is always the produce of the land. The tithe it comes from the flock, the herd, or it comes from the land. Well, what if you weren't a farmer? See, that's code for we don't have to tithe. The other is, well, there's no temple, there's no Levites. That's code for we don't have to tithe. Well, what about when there was a temple and there was Levites, but these people weren't farmers and herdsmen? What does that mean? Well, that means they didn't have to tithe. And where do you find that at? Well, what do you find they had to tithe? And see, that's one of those questions that I don't have an answer for. All I see is example. And the first example I see is Abraham. And again, I don't know where Abraham got the instructions to give a tenth of everything. I don't know. I suspect that Jacob got the instruction from Isaac, who got the instruction from Abraham, who promised YeHoVaH, Jacob, that he would give a tenth of all his possessions if YeHoVaH would take him into the land and bring him back. So I don't see those instructions, which is why I can't make a hard argument on certain things. I do see where produce and animals were supposed to be tithed. I don't see where silver and gold. But here's what I do see, that there were craftsmen in the land who didn't farm and who didn't raise herds or flocks. And I have to ask myself, how did they tithe? Were they required to tithe? And again, I don't have that answer from a scriptorial point of view, but I suspect that the people who received the instructions, and especially who understood the blessings and the cursings that is associated with those instructions, looked for some kind of way to give something. And I see this in the Kings, I see this in the Chronicles, where there were people who gave of their service. They didn't want to be left out. And that's the beauty when we understand the Almighty and his desire to bless his people. How many of you all want to be left out of the blessing? I know I don't. So if I wasn't a farmer and I wasn't a herdsman and I'm reading about the tithe or I'm hearing about the tithe, one of those questions that I would probably be asking Moses is, well, what about us? What do we do? Now, unfortunately, I don't see that question or Moses' response, but I know if I was in that situation, it's like, well, what do I give? Do I take my craft, change it into some money, and go and buy some produce so I can give a tithe from that? I don't know, folks. I don't know. But I know me, I would want to get in on the blessing somehow, some way, and I would definitely be inquiring of Moses or Aaron, YeHoVaH, somebody tell me something. So there were biblical occupations that were practiced. We know by the time of Yeshua, there were boat building. We know by the time when Moses brought the children of Israel, somebody built that candelabra. And when I look at Numbers 4 and I look at some of the other places and I see certain people who are responsible for crafting the furniture of the temple, that means somebody's got to go and cut wood, and somebody's got to powder gold, and somebody's got to begin to layer and do all kinds of things. And there's seamstresses and people who were crafted and gifted at making the tunics and the linen and everything that the priests wear and everything that the high priests wear and all of those kinds of things. And so I see that. There were weaving and spinning and tent making, basket weavers, potters. There's a famous story about a potter in Jeremiah's day. And so, like any person who desired to please YeHoVaH, I would be inquiring of him how I could find a way to please him so that I can experience the fullness of the blessings that he desired for his people to have. The furniture in the temple. And then, there were people who dedicated, they had to build a cart to carry it, because after they built it, they had to move it from place to place. And then there were mandatory offerings, first fruits. And of course, if you wanted to find out about the redemption of the firstborn, you can read Numbers chapter 18. And then there were vows. This was not in accordance to the first, second, or third tithe or first fruits. There were free will offerings. And these are things that people, based on the instructions that the Almighty gave to Moses, to where people could find a way, and maybe this is one of the ways that people would come and they would give these free will offerings, and they would make these vows unto the Almighty and dedicate family members, or dedicate themselves, or dedicate a piece of their land, or whatever. There were opportunities for people to give unto the Almighty. But let me tell you something. A stingy person is not looking for an opportunity to give nothing, because all they're going to do is take. And YeHoVaH is very clear that he's a giver. With that, I'm going to close. Father in heaven, I thank you for the opportunity to share this teaching. I pray that you be glorified in it. In Yeshua's name. Shalom, saints. Tithing and giving first fruit offerings are critical parts of the believer's faith and has its foundation back in Genesis 4:4, when Abel brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And YeHoVaH had respect unto Abel and to his offering. Abel was commended by YeHoVaH in Hebrews 11:4, where it states that by faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and by it he being dead yet speaketh. Solomon said in Proverbs 3:9 and 10, honor YeHoVaH with thy substance and with the first fruits of all thine increase. So shall your barns be filled with plenty, and your presses shall burst out with new wine. The prophet Malachi wrote in chapter 3, verse 11 and 12, to bring ye all the tithe into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house, and prove me now herewith, says YeHoVaH of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing, that there should not be room enough to receive it. And I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, and he shall not destroy the fruits of your ground, neither shall your vine cast her fruit before the time in the field, says YeHoVaH of hosts. And all nations shall call you blessed, for you shall be a delightsome land, saith YeHoVaH of hosts. When we tithe and give offerings consistently in obedience to YeHoVaH's commandments, we can count on him to keep his promises to us and consistently meet all of our needs. It is our Father's desire to bless you. However, it begins with you and your act of obedience to tithe and give offerings. Do it today. Shalom.
For more information, visit www.arthurbaileyministries.com or call 888-899-1479. House of Israel International Services is made possible through financial contributions from brothers and sisters like you. Thank you.